Good evening. I'm Rika Burnham, Head of Education. On the occasion of the Samuel H. Kress Lecture in Museum Education at the Frick Collection, it gives me great pleasure to extend a warm welcome to everyone here and to everyone who is joining us online. 6 years ago, and ever since, the Frick Collection has received a generous grant from the Samuel H. Kress Foundation to present a speaker at the Frick who would uniquely inspire museum educators and foster a rich dialogue among us. Each year we envision a topic that is progressive and relevant to our work. The series has included a philosopher, a literary theorist, the Cultural Affairs Commissioner of New York City, a director of museum education, a visionary digital media specialist, and this year, for the first time, a renowned art historian. With our speaker this year, Professor Michael Ann Hawley, Director Emeritus of Research and Academic Programs at the Clark Art Institute, we open our discourse to art history and the intellectual life of art history. Professor Hawley has pushed her discipline to take an unflinching look at itself in ways that have the potential to profoundly affect our work and thinking in art museums. As one of the foremost scholars in America, she examines the history of art history and the path not taken by art historians. In so doing, we discover she addresses a seldom noted alignment between art history and museum education, the methodological issues of art history and the pedagogical issues of museum education. In this alignment is a rich dialogue, as we find we share the very same question: how do we allow for and support the experience of art without using words, pushing beyond words, permitting access to, as Professor Hawley will tell us, access to the distant, the back, the beyond, the silent. A special thank you to Ian Wardropper, Director of the Frick Collection, Xavier Salomon, Chief Curator, for their support of the Kress Lectures, and of course to Max Marmer and the Samuel H. Kress Foundation, whose generosity in the field of museum education is rivaled only by the passion of the museum educators present here today. Please join me in welcoming the brilliant Professor Michael Ann Hawley to the Frick Collection.
I hope I can live up to the tiniest bit of her introduction. Thank you so much, Rika, for inviting me. Thanks to Adrian. Thanks to Max. It's a real joy. When Rika sent me a letter after hearing me lecture, and a similar lecture but different, at the IFA in the fall, I was so captivated by what she wrote, because she said, the art educator's dilemma is, do we mediate the visitor's experience of works of art with words, or can we sometimes set aside language in the form of presence? Something I've been thinking about for a while. So I am honored to try to talk about it and maybe answer a small part of your questions. Let me begin with a sentence from the narrator of W.G. Sebald's Austerlitz, emphasizing his great theme. If any of you read him, you'll know this, but here's his words. How little we can hold in mind, how everything is constantly lapsing into oblivion with every extinguished life, how the world is, as it were, draining itself in that the history of countless places and objects which themselves have no power of memory is never heard, never described, or passed on. So, I thought reading this, there are nevertheless certain objects, that is, works of visual art, that do indeed possess the power of memory, the power of agency, but perhaps we're not always sufficiently attuned to what they have to say. So the question is, how do I talk about this? Most sober art historians, I know from experience, including museum educators, sacrifice an attention to the magical presence of a work of art when they write or talk about it as something that encodes a particular history, how it functions as a representation. But the history of art of a half century ago, I want to argue in part tonight, might have pointed us in a different historiographic direction, but it didn't. Yet it might just be the case that art history today, with its concentration on a new sort of materiality, is heeding a few forgotten cues left over from another generation of writers on art. But first, a work of art. And you might wonder what that loop of paintings, they really details backgrounds of an artist I'm going to introduce this talk with, and that is Joachim Patinier. The afterlife of a few luminous paintings, the details, of course, were from his background landscapes, has quietly haunted my imagination, persisting and eluding any interpretive grasp, and I often wondered why. Training and intellectual habit do sometimes get in the way, so perhaps a change of focus was what I needed to explore their hold on me, on why I could not, even deliberately did not want to, write about them for a very long time. But first, let's just look at this rather strange painting, Patinier's Sharon Crossing the River Styx, executed somewhere between 1520 and 1524, the year of his death. Patinier is a mysterious, almost forgotten artist to whom not much attention had been paid until a 2007 Prado show. A few fragments of Patinier's biography are that he was born in what is now Belgium and spent his career in Antwerp, where he became a master painter in 1515, and where Dürer visited him in 1520 to 21. The goal of the Prado exhibition, according to its chief curator, and I'm quoting him here, was to understand his achievement as an artist by analyzing his biography, the meaning of his paintings, and the artistic, cultural, and economic context in which he produced his works. Context, that's a problematic word. It's a standard, if predictable, art historical protocol. But is that the only route for understanding his, quote, achievement as an artist? Patinier participated to some degree in the making of 29 paintings, only 12 of which evince a sustained quality, according to the connoisseurs in Spain, and this painting is one of them. The rest are claimed to be collaborations from his workshop, many of which enjoyed immediate market success. Credited as the inventor of world landscape paintings, his vistas are enchantingly panoramic, chock full of charming iconographic detail. This is Patinier's late vision of paradise and purgatory, in which a broad glassy river, by dividing the land of the blessed from that of the soon-to-be damned, flows to the rim of the known world. At its center, a gigantic Charon, the ferryman of Hades, crosses the river Styx, transporting a poor lost soul whose fixed gaze falls upon the easy, little does he know, passage ahead. The shore, where they're headed, at first beckons with its lush meadows, flowering orchards, and fluttering birds. Now the poor soul might have chosen his path between good and evil differently, but now, at the moment of his death, all is lost. The watery channel, flowing under the darkening clouds, winds through sinister shadows until it emerges at the fiery gates of Hades, with the hideous three-headed Cerberus waiting to welcome its next pale victim. Woe is he who turns his back on the heavenly paradise of the other shore, where a wispy winged angel, perched on a promontory, watches over other divine messengers accompanying a fortunate couple of saved souls, while pointing to the path, rocky as it may be, that will eventually lead to the crystalline fountain of life from which 4 streams flow under blue heavens where salvation awaits. Now, of course, it's always delightful, as well as a learned activity, to decipher these kinds of stories nesting within other stories. Nobody taught us that better than Erwin Panofsky, the supreme iconologist. But what first attracted me to Patinir's art was not its commitment to a certain iconography, not that which lies in the foreground of his paintings, but its quiet background of translucent blues, ultramarine, cobalt, indigo, lapis lazuli, teal, azure, sapphire, cerulean, those skies that intimate a nearly forgotten, faraway, and limitless yet promised world. The painter's blues lie at the edge of the world, beyond the visible. Spending time with them, I think of Italo Calvino's Invisible Cities, in which Kublai Khan is regaled with Marco Polo's fantasy. Quote, Marco thought of the mists that cloud the expanse of the sea and the mountain ranges, and when dispelled, leave the air dry and diaphanous, revealing distant cities. Unquote. Patinir gives us a dream drenched in blue, celestial blues that halt, arrest our look, cause us temporarily not to remember the mixture of classical and Christian iconography that presumably was the source of this painting's commission, as well as several of his others. Patinir's circuitous landscapes request, I think, other paths of exploration, paths in concert with the painter's sublime viewpoints, distant panoramas, and alternation of light and shade. There are words, no doubt, born from a kind of felt and intense reverie that might describe the effect of these blues on viewers, rich descriptions that might do justice to his palette's poetry, so often overlooked in the effort to decipher an iconographic meaning. Nevertheless, it feels to me always like something of a travesty to interrupt the cerulean silence by speaking out loud about the timeless enchantment of this painting, its soft blues and greens, its spell of quiet transcendence, its evocation of the circularity of time. Forgotten mysteries captured in paint. From whence comes our compulsion to attempt verbal mastery over such unconquerable visuality? If we wished our reaction to art to summon the ghost residing in material objects, to answer Sebald, especially painting, we could, of course, heed a rhetorical lesson from Marcel Proust, who wrote in the second decade of the 20th century, and here quoted in a beautiful passage about metempsychosis, or the transmigration of souls. It's kind of long, but I want to read it to you. This is Proust. I feel that there is much to be said for the Celtic belief that the souls of those whom we have lost are held captive in some inferior being, in an animal, in a plant, in some inanimate object, perhaps in a painting, and so effectively lost to us until the day, which to many never comes, when we happen to pass by the tree, I guess you could say the painting, or to obtain possession of the object that forms their prison. Then they start and tremble. They call us by our name, and as soon as we have recognized their voice, the spell is broken. Delivered by us, they have overcome death and returned to share our life. And so it is with our own past. It is a labor in vain to attempt to recapture it. All the efforts of our intellect must prove futile. The past is hidden somewhere outside the realm, beyond the reach of the intellect, in some material object, in the sensation which that material object will give us, which we do not suspect. And as for that object, it depends on chance whether we come upon it or not before we ourselves must die." Unquote. Henri Bergson, around the same time, speaks about how special visual images are eternally, quote, interlaced with memory, and inversely a memory only becomes actual by borrowing the body of some perception into which it slips. These two acts, perception and recollection, always interpenetrate each other, he says, are always exchanging something of their substance. So I began to wonder, is it ever the charge of art history or art education to consider such personal Proustian meditations, let alone try to articulate them with respect to individual paintings? If so, is it formal description alone that bears the weight of this disciplinary responsibility? How, as an art historian, do I translate Patinier's almost palpable silences, these soft exchanges, whose enchantments have all but been rendered mute and forgotten by iconographic, biographical, and cultural historical chatter? With that question, I come to the heart of what I want to say about the history of art history, even though I need construe Panofsky, my intellectual hero, as something of an historiographic anti-hero. We just have a blank for, whoops, more Patiniers. Okay. When I began writing Panofsky's intellectual biography nearly 40 years ago, I had already been captivated by his persuasive 3 levels of art historical interpretation when it came to studying Renaissance art history. The pre-iconographic stage, the attention to lines, forms, colors, and so on. The iconographic, attention to overt subject matter, often as it comes from a text. And the iconological stage, consideration of this, what he calls the something else of a work, as a cultural or even a psychoanalytic symptom. Iconography turned interpretive, he first called it in 1939. Now, Panofsky's conceptual terrain has by now been deeply furrowed, so I hardly need to go over it again in critical detail for this audience. From the middle of the last century until nearly its end, that scheme signaled a secure interpretive route. But what about a route not often ventured upon, as Stephen Melville calls it, in the history of art in the middle of the 20th century? Early modern art historians certainly gained something significant in the wake of Panofsky, that's without doubt. But might we not have forgotten something as well when we left the promise of phenomenology to contemporary art criticism and history? Now, perhaps no longer. The discipline's current, right now, fascination with thing theory, objecthood, materiality, agency, and so on, I'll talk more about that in a little while, points toward an unknown historiograph path, unfurling forward, yes, but also harking backward to mid-century phenomenology. European scholars then question the methodological obsession with historical context in the visual arts, and in doing so, they nearly undermine the faith and the foundation upon which the iconological method rests. Take Hans Georg Gadamer, who declared in an essay of 1977 called The Relevance of the Beautiful that it is an objective prejudice of astonishing naivete for our first question to be, what does this picture represent? So much has been written by Panofsky's disciples under the aegis of contextual studies that we sometimes forget that there once existed powerful alternatives, and clearly phenomenology is still a live one. I'm using the term phenomenology quite loosely here to call attention to a certain kind of aesthetic thinking that emphasizes the immediacy and singularity of experience, not the causality behind it. To invoke Gadamer again, art achieves more than the mere manifestation of meaning. The fact that a work of art exists, its facticity, represents an insurmountable resistance against any superior presumption than we could make sense of it at all. Imagine reading those kind of statements, Gadamer's thoughts, in tandem with the Patineer scholarship that revolves exclusively around questions of attribution and iconography. Never the twain shall meet. It is almost as though phenomenology turns iconology inside out and upside down, as well as vice versa, I presume. Then as now, in the writing of art history, it often comes down to a confrontation between presentation and representation, phenomenology and iconology. It's a matter of direction. Panofsky, in a deliberately retroactive move, begins with the work of art and then metaphorically carries it back into the world before it came to exist, and masterfully, he might say objectively, reconstructs an iconographic and cultural surround that would eventuate in its creation. While Gadamer would never deny the significance of this historical world for the work of art, what he desires most, and first of all, is to elicit from is its complex iconography. While it is doubtless a product of a particular historical era and a particular artist's life history, we encounter even an artwork from long ago as immediately present. Past works of art, though originating in a now lost historical world, continue actively to exist in the present, even to the point of engendering meanings where none has existed before. And this meaning possesses a different charge than Panofsky's, with his faith and historical detachment, a word he kept emphasizing. For Gadamer's hermeneutic regards the encounter between past and present as productive of another sort. Something happens when the two engage, two different axes of temporalities crossing at right angles to one another. The present experience of a work of art as it appears to a singular consciousness and not its social and cultural analysis is what is of primary importance for Gadamer, as well as his putative spectator. Could the differences in professional rhetoric between Gadamer and Panofsky be more sharply drawn? In Gadamer's terms, the work of art issues a challenge which expects to be met. It requires an answer, and probably not an iconographic one, an answer that can only be given by someone who accepts the challenge. And that answer, Gadamer says, must be his own and given actively. That kind of sentiment would be anathema to Panofsky and his hard-won faith in historical distance and scholarly detachment. to quote him, to grasp reality, Panofsky says, we have to detach ourselves from the present. Not only will the art historian collect and verify all the available factual information as to medium, condition, age, authorship, destination, and so on, but he will also compare the work with others of its class and will examine such writings as reflect the aesthetic standards of its country and age in order to achieve a more objective appraisal of its quality. So it's never just a choice, it's never a simple choice between historical explanation and hermeneutic engagement. In essence, this posited confrontation between two major mid-century thinkers elicits two different convictions about both time and history, not to mention different conceptions of art historical writing and education. History or tradition should be, Gadamer says, for us as we are now, not by repeated recreation, but rather through an active encounter with it. Does the work originate then, back then, or here before me? If every work of art, visual or literary, is an encounter, a so-called increase in being that profoundly affects those who are ensnared by it, does its origin, as Martin Heidegger might ask, not lie in the now? If so, what happens to the contemporary viewer's sense of tradition, of what has come before? Philosophers such as Gadamer would no doubt answer that historical consciousness and the new self-conscious reflection arising from it combine with the claim that we simply cannot renounce, namely the fact that everything we see stands there before us and addresses us directly as if it showed us ourselves, unquote. Now, how on earth are art historians to write about this experience, an experience that abstains from the primal art historical desire to clarify? The roster of contemporary artists that phenomenologists favored at mid-century is always headed by Cézanne. In admiration of Cézanne, whom he emphasized painted the act of perception rather than what is perceived, the French phenomenologist Maurice Merleau-Ponty, in his Eye and Mind essay of 1960, squeezes out the last drop of historical consciousness in favor of the embodied experience of the aesthetic moment. Quoting Merleau-Ponty, the magic loses its final argument if the entire potential of a painting is that of a text to be read, a text totally free of promiscuity between the seeing and the seen. He says that Cézanne's mountain before us makes itself seen, and both the painter and the spectator interrogate it in turn with their beholding. Vision originates, he would claim, in the coexistence of the spectator's body with the world around him or her, a circuit in which the act of painting intervenes like phenomenological reflection as a third element to clarify the reciprocal connection of the other two. It's quoting another art historian there, Robert Klein. So that brings us to presence. If an art historian chooses this route, and keeping Patineer's iridescent and shimmering blues in mind, she immediately confronts the predicament of what kind of rhetoric, if any, spoken or written, to summon in dealing with past works of art. Phenomenology at its most suggestive is an art of resistance, of hesitation, a valiant yet impossible attempt to hover just this side of meaning. In its desire to catch the ungraspable, it struggles to become an account of perception before it crosses into what is perceived. Is that the aesthetic moment, perhaps? Intuition rather than intellect, feeling rather than thought. No doubt, again, it's not so simple. And if an art historian wishes verbally to describe these visual sensations, how to accomplish the translation. As Benjamin once remarked, all that can be transmitted from one language to another is information. Works of art, however, are about something far greater than the transmittal of subject matter. What Benjamin calls the unfathomable, the mysterious, the poetic, will rarely be caught. The presence of an historical work of art in the contemporary visual world momentarily shifts the magnetic poles of what is seen and known. Visual art is performative in its capacity to move its spectator. If a scholar is seized by a work of art and takes something of it for her own, she must give something back in return. If a certain image sears into consciousness, if it continues to encourage its viewer to see something more or other than that which it immediately shows, only then can its chronicler react by burnishing matter-of-fact prose until it shines with poetic luster. A brilliant description takes us part of the way there, but the aspirations of formless language tend toward universalist appeal rather than to the particularity of a viewer and her experience of an object shot through with recollected memories in a Bergsonian sense. Presence is very often accompanied by its companion, silence. To restore silence is the role of objects, Samuel Beckett once uttered. To restore silence is the role of objects. Silence, the very condition required for contemplation, for acknowledging the performative presencing of the work of art before its viewers. The image in Barth's conception speaks to us precisely when it is silent, when it no longer transmits any message to us directly. No one painted this quiet world better than Chardin. His little painting, Young Student Drawing of 1738, exquisitely invokes Diderot's notions like harmony, peace, and silence. Some of the most rhapsodic descriptions of a Chardin painting's quiet presence belong to some of the most noted recent historians of art. Michael Baxendall writes that the painter learned to speak with extreme demanding quietness. This is how he catches and holds attention. The impoverished art student, notice the eye-catching tear in his roughly woven topcoat, itself testimony to the cold of the room in which he paints. He's wrapped in his artistic labors, that he's the quintessentially absorbed subject who, in Michael Fried's terms, causes his viewer, in Diderot's visual prose, to, quote, stop in front of it, as if by instinct, as a traveler tired of his journey sits down, almost without being aware of it, in a spot that offers him a bit of greenery, I think I'd say bluery, perhaps, silence, water, shade, and coolness. Absorption transpires here, not only because this is essentially a painting of backs, whether the students or the canvases stacked against the wall, but also because of the saturated mood of envelopment and obliviousness to the viewer outside, who stands apart certainly, but is nonetheless lured into an exchange with it. The student literally turns his back on us. No pictorial theatrics here. The reverie of the young man inspires, in turns, perceptions and recollections of our own. Light and shadow, tone and texture conspire to create a triumphant vision of painted silence, as Tom Crow has emphasized. Crow's close formal reading of this intensely private doctrine is a masterful exercise in poetic description. I'll read it to you. The coat itself signals a shortage of coal. The unmended hole, poverty's indifference to appearance. Ostensibly, the gap simply reveals a glimpse of the lining underneath, but the choice of color and the fact that it is rendered with a single stroke of red visibly on top of its neighbors make it the unmissable surrogate for a wound, which burns in a way that the unseen stove does not. The dark brown touches adjacent to it lend the opening the depth of an incision. The large and lethal-looking knife dropped on the floor nearby to sharpen the chalk, to cut the paper, might be the instrument of a butcher or an assassin. A further dragged touch of red paint draws a livid note along the knife's handle. With such a miniature adamantine narrative, this author, Tom Crow, deliberately lets slip the objectifying distance between present and past so as to afford us a moving insight, the evidence of an intense involvement between painting and viewer, painting and writer. In its physical vibrancy, its affect and effect, this special thing, this work of art, possesses a certain kind of agency. As spectators, we can, and often do, animate material works of art as though they were live beings, capable of communicating novel ideas and principled commitments back to us. The thought of the painting, we say. The painting thinks. The obdurate physicality of things and their effect on their viewers has often been repressed in art history because of its eagerness and its skill at energizing some kind of contextual production, whether configured as social background, stylistic developments, iconographic precedents, artistic genealogies, traces of gendered identities, psychoanalytic symptoms, and so on and so on. At the other extreme, formal aesthetics long ago seduced the attention of philosophers of art away from objects so that they might dwell not with the stuff of the world so much as in an abstract, rarefied realm. Consequently, it is refreshing to entertain a rejuvenated commitment to the objectness of the object, maybe even the thing in its thingliness, to paraphrase Martin Heidegger. Materiality is more than a medium. Works of art are wrapped round by the resistance of matter to which embodied spectators react. After all, Merleau-Ponty says, the world is around me, it's not in front of me. The exchange need not only be about locating meaning. Materiality is something that gets in the way of certain kinds of thinking, sometimes even kinds of looking, if seeing involves looking through to something that lies before or behind or beyond. Materiality in works of art is that which halts transparency. Such maneuvers are unthinkable in positivist terms, Georges Didi Uberman has argued. A phenomenological reorientation consists in, these are his words, in not grasping the image, of letting oneself be grasped by it instead. Thus, most importantly, letting go of one's knowledge about it, unquote. Let's look at a penultimate picture for this evening, one that is not necessarily well known by a contemporary museum goer. It's another early modern painting, like Patinier's in some ways of almost a century earlier, Patinier being earlier, whose subject unfolds under expansive skies, but this one occurring in an enchanted moon-filled night. Adam Elsheimer, in the early 17th century, here painted what has been authoritatively called the first true moonlight night scene in European painting. Its ostensible subject, the flight into Egypt, where the donkey is carrying Mary and the Christ child, and Joseph brings up the rear with his lantern as the little family walks measuredly towards a few shepherds whose campfire sparks fly upwards to merge with the stars in heaven. All is calm, all is bright, thanks to the beautiful and benevolent silvery moon reflected in the water, the source of the real poetic story lying behind or before the iconographic one. And then there are the sparkling stars dotting the heavens, including the trail of the magnificent Milky Way coursing through the heavens, culminating in the right-hand corner with the constellation of the Great Bear. Sentiment first, sense later, not grasping the image as Didi Uberman urged, but being grasped by it. What do we need from paintings? What is it like to give sustained attention to a particular work? What, as Rika Burnham has asked, does it take to slip into the world of the object? In my Musée Imaginaire, I would hang this beautiful work, the past materialized, alone in a room with no written explanation whatsoever, yet encourage viewers to linger with its poetic effects before proceeding to a second gallery that would be filled with reproductions and enticing historical as well as art historical iconological information. Now, what would that be? Such as, here's a small list, that this is the last painting before the young Elsheimer's death at the age of 33, that of the story of how the German painter came to live in Rome and his acquaintance with Rubens while there, that of the story of the Holy Families fleeing the tyranny of Herod and the massacre of the innocents, that of the relationship between backgrounds and foregrounds in early modern painting, that 1609, the date on the back of this painting, was the year before Galileo published his findings about the surface of the moon and his observations about the Milky Way, that the painter and the astronomer were acquaintances through the Academy of Sciences in Rome, that there were several telescopes in circulation in Rome because of this famed academy that very summer, the story of nocturnal scenes in the history of art, and so on and so on. The second room could be absolutely stuffed. Context. Now, I don't know how to accomplish this dialectic, but I would wish that viewers then return to the first room, a place of retreat resistant to narrative expectations and linear temporalities, in order to sit alone once again with Elsheimer's art and see what transpires anew, yet keeping the dialogue between phenomenology and iconology alive. I do believe that the two perspectives can and need to coexist, but since cultural and social history has dominated the history of art for the last half-century, I would like for a time to return to the power that resides in the work of art's visual poetry. Visual poetry exceeds the words that are written about it. Still art still matters silently. Just a parenthetical remark before I talk about the last painting. My ideal form of art writing militates against the plain ever landing, so to speak. I'm not trying to demonstrate anything. I want to suggest, hope to provide, enhance, indicate, allude, and so on, to that which escapes a positivistic or empirically based argument. Not a poet, I'm just someone wishing to walk and write a tightrope between meaning and non-meaning by trying to capture what images do to us rather than what we can do to images. So permit me to tarry for a final 5-10 minutes or so and conclude with one of my favorite pictures, this one in Stockholm, a 17th century painting that may or may not be by Rembrandt and is loosely called A Christian Scholar in a Vaulted Room, 1631. I'd been enchanted with this painting for years, but had never seen the original. When invited to speak at the Swedish National Museum a couple of years ago, I inquired on that occasion if I might see the painting somewhere because I could not locate it anywhere in the museum. I was escorted down to the storage vault where it had been quietly resting in the dark for some years. Was it banished there by the Rembrandt Research Project, I wondered? Had it failed that team's harsh and often discredited standards of what might be attributed to the master? Another thing, its reproductions had made me assume that it was much larger than this small painting actually is. This slide here makes it seem huge. It's a delicate, small thing. How could so much of a meditative mood be condensed into such a small and delicate material artifact? How can a work of art as rare as this hold my imagination in thrall? Show you a detail of the tiny painting. There, the Christian scholar sits in his chilly room, his feet nestled cozily on a charcoal burner, a crucifix on a small altar behind him. I'm hoping you can see that. And to the right, tacked on the wall, an illegible script written on a piece of paper, all tenebrous details that draw curiosity in and make us desire to know more, to give more to the picture, perhaps, than the picture wants to give us. Baudelaire, in a poem about Rembrandt, but not talking about this painting, invokes a room, he says, that is adorned by one enormous crucifix in which a sudden ray of winter sunlight falls. It seems so appropriate to this painting, I had to say it. The name long attached, Anastasius, may or may not be accurate. A 4th century martyr, a pope, a jurist, a bishop, or most likely an Eastern Orthodox church father of the 7th century, abbot of Mount Sinai, known for his scriptural commentaries. But neither the name of the artist, not even this artist, nor the identification of the subject really matters, at least not right off the bat. That's all I'm saying. Why not? Sometimes for art historians, it takes a real effort to forget the work of art as an object buttressed by external, historical, social, and cultural forces, rather than see it as a surface for contemplation, something to think with rather than about. Phenomenologists such as Gaston Bachelard offer warnings. Quote, "The prudent attitude itself is a refusal to obey the immediate dynamics of the image, either in poetry or in paint," unquote. Speaking of spaces and rooms born of memories in his wonderful book, 1958, called The Poetics of Space, the classic look at how we experience intimate places, Bachelard asks magical questions about solitude and its companion, solace. And these questions, again, he wasn't talking about this painting, but the reverie, it seems to me to be similar. I'm quoting Bachelard here. Was the room a large one? Was the garret cluttered up? Was the nook warm? How, in this fragment of space, did the human being achieve silence? How did he relish the very special silence of solitary daydreaming? Here the unconscious abides. Memories are motionless, unquote. No art historical pyrotechnics here, just quiet. Obviously, for me, this work has all the transfiguring ingredients that appeal on another register. A scholar alone with his books, completely absorbed in his reading and silent ruminations, the quiet that settles over him at this certain time of day, this time of year. Reverie, reflection, oblivious not only to the world outside, but even to his own spacious surround. And most of all, this pensive figure's total lack of acknowledgement of us, whomever we may be as observers, either in the 17th century or in the 21st. Appropriating Bachelard's words on a hermit's hut, another essay, the picture makes me daydream about solitude, what he calls a valorization of a center of concentrated solitude. The hermit is alone before God, and there radiates about this centralized solitude a universe of meditation and prayer, a universe outside the universe. How is it that images as rare as these should possess such power over the imagination, unquote. And Bachelard wasn't even asking this of painting. Resonances, reveries, reverberations. This painting, for a moment, possesses its viewer, I think, through and through. Wandering thoughts. It's difficult even to see around its murmurings, its edges. Nabokov, in a wonderful passage from his 1972 novel, Transparent Things, remarks that, quote, when we concentrate on a material object, whatever its situation, the very act of attention may lead to our involuntarily sinking into the history of that object. Novices must learn to skim over matter if they want matter to stay at the exact level of the moment. Transparent things through which the past shines. This subject of this small work, the subject being contemplation, had so saturated its very being that 400 years later it remains more of an event than a painted object. Its aura is intact. I'll show you the whole again. Seeing it there, maybe even if it had been hanging on the museum wall upstairs, delivered a sting, a prick, that even a good reproduction could never, ever confer. Walter Benjamin describes the sensation best. He says, even the most perfect reproduction of a work of art is lacking in one element, its presence in time and space, its unique existence at the place where it happens to be. This unique existence of the work of art determined the history to which it was subject throughout the time of its existence, unquote. In the 400 years of its material life, the thingness of the thing accruing worlds like barnacles of time, two temporalities, past and present, intertwining. Embodied here is the acute awareness that this thing, this very object, has been touched, has been painted by a most sensitive and talented someone, long gone, long ago. And secondly, arises the creeping recognition that this work of art has a longer and richer life ahead of it than its beholders can ever hope for. No doubt it will outlast us, whomever, whenever we may be. It is only in confronting the actual material object that we also encounter our own mortality, an awareness of the endless cycle of being and becoming. So how to write and speak and teach about all this? How do art historians interlace these sorts of sentiments through all the iconological, connoisseurial, social, biographical, all those other contextual narratives that dominate the study of 17th century Northern art, Rembrandt in particular? Not that there's anything misguided about these venerable art historical approaches. It's just that we should never, ever forget the dual nature of a visual object. One as a cipher of history, that is, as an image that encodes, as a discourse that encodes a history, and two, the image as an aesthetic interruption, that is, as a raw material expression. Nobody need legislate the choice. An original work of art, a Rembrandt painting, for example, exists in our own time and space, even in the artificial ambience of a museum, and it beckons us for corporeal response by dint of its own phenomenological material presence. The world of the past is metonymically attached to the present through the physical stuff it has left behind, material metonymy. It is the recognition that an authentic fragment or vestige of something once rich and whole lingers there in its own material aftermath. Time, Rembrandt's ours, dissolves into space, condensed, compressed, concentrated, and consumed. What is encountered there is not just the stories about context that led to its existence once upon a time, but a material performance, the living, pulsating afterlife of the past, here and now. Thanks.
Thank you, Professor Holly, for your beautiful painted presence. Professor Holly has agreed to take questions for about 10 minutes or so, after which everyone is invited to join her and all of us in the garden court for reception. We have people with microphones, so that if you have a question, could you wait to get a microphone so that it will be recorded and shared with our online audience. Whoops. Okay.
Oh, hi. Thank you so much for that. As you were describing in this last section, you used the word prick, and I expected to hear Bart come up, and I wonder if there's some reason you resisted talking about the punctum.
No, I said it was Bart.
Oh, yes,
Yeah.
but I wondered if you had some thoughts about the way in which what you're describing might be related more closely to that slide between subjectivity and objectivity that he's so, I think, is so part of photography for him, and the punctum, and the different temporalities that he is also engaging in the punctum.
It's a very Bartian analysis. I mean, Bart is a complex character, not to mention writer, and he writes differently at different times of his life. But you're speaking of camera lucida. And indeed, he would say that in photography, the iconography that I've been talking about in relation to early modern paintings, but the stories behind the particular photograph, the iconographic stories behind the photograph, constitutes the studium. And you can be looking at a photograph, and many you can pass by without any special affinity for what's going on. You're just interested perhaps in composition or their historical being, but something sometime in the punctum, the pointedness, will prick your consciousness, and it gets a hold on you that you can't easily relinquish. So he was, in that book, what I would consider to be my most consummate phenomenology in the middle of the century.
Hello, thank you very much for your presentation. You had mentioned about breaking up the experience of a painting by ideally having it in one room so you can reflect upon it and then going to a different environment or area to. My question was in the context of digital technology and experiential exhibit design and such forth. If you can elaborate on various ways of how can you help create those informational sessions with a piece of art, but then also that reflection, and if the digital technological advancements can help curate and orchestrate that experience.
Sorry, am I robbing the audience of this? I'm going to give, as you can imagine from hearing me, a kind of old-fashioned answer to you. Digital renditions of works now are amazing, and you can sometimes see things, especially in early modern paintings, that you couldn't possibly see with your naked eye. However, what I've been claiming is the experience of a work of art is related to its being a material artifact right there in front of you from a time past that you cannot, I think, get from digital reproductions, that you have to have the experience of this thing in itself that's been touched by somebody, that's been painted by somebody, that you feel. You know, Benjamin once said, history writing is an act of, history writing is a handshake towards the dead. Now I know you can't touch a painting at the Frick Museum, for example, but if you're there with it in some kind of conversation, dialogue, whatever, it's because you're in front of the real and actual thing, even though you might see its details better if it were digitally rendered. Does that help at all?
Of using the technology to tell the narrative behind the story, and not necessarily with the art and how they.
Yeah.
Because I agree
Okay.
with that aspect.
Okay. Yes, I understand that. Thank you.
Thank you for the wonderful talk.
Hello there, Charles. Former graduate student.
One of the sort of themes that had been running through your entire talk was the significance as well as the problems of language. And just to sort of refer back to another idea that George D.D. Uberman proposed, is that an iconographically and iconologically oriented art historian would actually convert what is visual in front of him or her into what is visible, which he then, or she, turns into legible, which then becomes intelligible. It is as if there is this kind of sifting process where you reduce what is presented to us into something that can be, sort of circulated in the form of discourse. And you are sort of suggesting that there should be another way of writing about works of art that gets away from that mode, that established mode.
It is a paradox. I want writing about art to be legible and suggesting what can't be read, the back, the beyond, the silences, and so on. D.D. Uberman is also, he's a wonderful writer on early modern art as well as everything else. He's a phenomenon. But I'm thinking particularly of an essay in which he talks about the cloister of San Marco and Fra Angelico's paintings in it. And he tries to come to grips with those single paintings in a monk's cell and the experience that he has of them, and maybe starts reading the experience that a Renaissance monk might have had of them. And he tries and fails, deliberately fails to bring those two worlds together, to point out how complex, how rich the image is that resists any final interpretation. He knows everything about the world of Fra Angelico, or liturgy, sermons, and so on, that try to help explain that painting. But at the same time, he's saying the interesting thing that you find out is what you can't talk about. And the silence is the subject of those paintings as well, that they envelop, they bring you into them, and suddenly there is nothing more to be said. It's an experience without words.
So that response actually in part answers my question to which I was leading up. So how would you teach this writing? How would you encourage students? I mean, as a training teacher myself, it's something that I constantly struggle with. So I'd just like to hear your personal thoughts on how you would encourage your own students into thinking
You
about
were once my student. I failed. I clearly failed. I like to think that I do it by innuendo, by indirection, because there is no direct route to thinking or writing. And, I can't do it myself, actually, so how can I teach it? So it's only by suggestion that you open up your writing to intuition rather than just intellect. That look at those great writers I quoted from the past. They could do it. Baudelaire, Bachelard. They participated in a kind. Well, in Rika's terms, you slip into the object, and suddenly you're writing not just for yourself, you feel, but for being with the object. I don't think there's any direct route. I don't think it is teachable. I don't even think, with few magisterial writers of the past, that you could have a piece of writing that would do this. But I would plead, and do plead, with students to let, for lack of a better word, poetry into their soul when writing about works of art.
Hello, thank you. So my question is more of a jumping off from the previous question. So then would you say your approach is limited in period? So for example, there was something you said in response to the previous question where someone had to touch, to like feel, but not maybe literally in the museum setting, something that was touched or felt by someone else in the distant past. What if we're working with a contemporary object which doesn't have a direct physical connection, but perhaps has a reference or a contextual link?
Of course, that's a real challenge to any of this. It's interesting, though, that from the middle to the end of the last century, those writers such as Michael Fried or Roz Krauss, who wrote about contemporary art, they wrote through a phenomenological perspective. Art hadn't become dematerialized as much at this point, and it'd be interesting to know what was said. I don't and can't and won't answer that because I only write about early modern art and the poignancy, in particular, of worlds that are lost and long gone. There might be somewhere an interesting answer to your question about what do we do with performances or conceptual art or something. What is a phenomenological approach there, since I'm basing mine on history, past time, but I don't know what it is yet.
I don't have so much a question as perhaps a suggestion. Because when I'm looking, I'm over here.
Oh, okay.
I'm looking at the Chardin and the attributed to Rembrandt painting and the Cézanne, and I'm also a painter. So I'm thinking, nowhere in your discussion have you addressed facture in a direct way. Mm-hmm. And to me, I look at the white arched, light in that painting, and I'm looking at the kind of diagonal brush strokes, and where they're coming up against that much darker golden stone, that forms the arch around it. And I'm looking at the way the light is illuminating the figure and the way the artist has summarized the face. And I would think that that's something about the magic of the painting, that the paintedness of the painting and the way the painting has been made. And that's also the presence of the painting. When you stand in front of it, you see what's represented, but not just what's represented, but how it's represented in the language of paint. And I think that's, for me, all the quotes from all the famous writers sort of always fall short of that experience, because it is not a literary experience. Things can be beautifully described, poetically described, but it doesn't get to the heart of it, of the presence of the painting. It's more about what the artist did with the brush or with the sanguine or whatever material they were using.
I think I wouldn't disagree with anything that you said. and it has long been the case in American art history, particularly in material cultural studies, to talk about the materials and even the facture and, yes, the sweep of the brush and so on. I was kind of avoiding that train in order to talk about what's been happening in art history of late with thing theory and objecthood, and the object lives, the object thinks, and so on. But I see no reason whatsoever why an attention, a close attention, maybe even a poetic attention to the way the light falls on a particular corner of a window could not, by beginning with that, open up a world of other thoughts and ruminations and meditations about this painting, certainly.
I was an intern many years ago at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and the curator of contemporary art, Henry Geltzeller, took the interns into the contemporary galleries. And this is kind of an answer to or some of the ruminations I've had about how we translate this into teaching. Because I think, in a sense, you've modeled and suggested for us a way to each of us to think about how we might either metacognitively or even suggest outright that we spend time with the presence and silence of things. But back to the curator in the 70s, he took the group of interns up to a Rothko, and he had us stand very close. And he only said 3 words. He said, "This is red." And he had us, and then he didn't say anything more. And we stood there in silence for about 10 minutes. And we thought it was the most profound experience we'd ever had. And I've thought of this story frequently over the years because it became a story that I thought that could have only happened at that time. It would be ridiculous now. Nobody would ever do that. But now I'm thinking, in the context of what you presented, it was actually a phenomenological and pedagogical moment that he created for us.
That's a wonderful story. And can I answer it with a story of my own, since you brought it?
Would like you to.
Rothko. Many years ago, I had a fellowship at the National Gallery in Washington, and I can't believe they did this, but they did let us go into exhibitions after the museum was closed. I mean, there would be guards there, but we could quietly go through popular exhibitions that were crowded normally. And at the year I was there was a huge Rothko retrospective. And being an early modern art historian, I didn't know that much about Rothko. I liked some things, I didn't like others. And so I thought, I'll spend an hour and a half in these rooms, and I'll learn something about him. And I saw that he was a figurative painter first, and read every description, then saw the development of his abstraction. I was being a dutiful and dutiful, I'll leave it at that, incipient art historian looking at things. And finally, it was a large show, I came into the room. You may talk about red, I'll talk about brown. I came into the last room where the brown and black paintings were by themselves. And I have no idea why, but I started to cry. I was so overwhelmed by this is brown, that it was a magical experience for me, because I had not up to that point in my life ever been so moved by a work of art. And I don't know that it was because of what I had learned in all the previous rooms. I don't think so. I think that was pushed away, and this is brown occurred to me.
So thank you, everyone. Thank you. I invite you to continue the rich dialogue that has been sparked by Professor Holly in the garden court. Thank you for coming. Thank you, Professor.
Thank you.